why don't we start by having you tell us how you got to Atlanta and how and when you began to work with Julian Bond.
Well, in June of 1960, I went to Miami, Florida to be in a workshop that was conducted by the Congress of Racial Equality. And I should say, parenthetically, that's before CORE became crazy, as it is today. And from there, went to New Orleans, where they were getting ready to do the integration of the first public school. So that was 1960. And in Miami, Florida, which was totally segregated in those days, you know, we got arrested and so forth and so on. And I went with the group to New Orleans, and they asked me to do some outreach in the white community. So that's a whole other story you can ask me about later. So I was so unbelievably, the words fail me. I mean, I had found my people, I had found what I wanted to do. The rest of my life, I was 22, and I came home and I started writing letters and how I could go back south. And did anybody want a little Jewish New Yorker? No. And I didn't know it, but SNCC at that time didn't even have an address, but I was writing letters and nobody was answering me. And by an incredible fluke of fate, I managed to get a job in Atlanta at the Southern Regional Council. And I started there in June of 1961. And I suppose for your students, they should know that every single person that they meet in their life is precious, and they should try to be on the good side of every person that they ever meet, because this was a total fluke. And the person who was then the research director at SRC had been a professor at Queens College, where I went to school. And he was the only black professor, the only one in the entire school, and his contract was not renewed, and I got to know him, and I was the editor of the newspaper. And when I wrote to SRC, it turns out that miraculously he had become the research director, and he said, "Come down, I'll give you a job," which is the only reason I ever got there. See, a lot of people arrived in the South with a suitcase, and they said, "Here I am," you know, people like me. "Oh, this is what I want to do," black people and white people. But I was much too cautious for that, and I had to have a job. So I got a job with SRC, and doing an interesting job, actually. It turned out that I compiled the research and did most of the writing for what is now a famous survey that they did about the sit-in movement, which ended up on page 1 in the New York Times the following August. And it was a retrospective of the first year and a half of the civil rights movement. And I had spent weeks and weeks and weeks going through their files and finding out where people were arrested and how many people were arrested and who was arrested and what were the demands. I actually didn't realize it, but I was becoming a little mini expert of the first year and a half of the sit-in movement. So I wrote that paper, and then spent the next all of these months, I was clipping out articles about SNCC, but I was so shy and I was so in awe that I never went to the SNCC office, which was about 15 minutes walk away. I was on Forsyth Street, and the SNCC office was on Auburn Avenue. So what was that? 20 minutes walk. And I just couldn't bring myself to go see all of these heroes. And a Danish writer came to SRC, and he said, "I want to go to the SNCC office. Will you come with me?" So somehow or other, I got the courage up, and I went over with him. And whereupon we met James Foreman, the great Jim Foreman, who took one look at me and said, "Can you type?" This famous thing that became part of the women's movement about how women were treated and so forth. And women were not definitely not treated, super well, even though inside the civil rights movement, I think that they were treated better than on the outside. But I never interpreted this as a sexist remark, because Jim was whom I loved beyond who I would have walked through fire for. He had no small talk. He had no time. He was only single-minded about the movement. And his head was like this giant switchboard. And he knew exactly which openings there were, and he needed someone who could type. That was the purpose of that question, not because as a woman, I was naturally expected to type. And I said, yes, I can. And he said, I need you, and will you come in after work? So for the next several months, I worked during the day at the Southern Regional Council, and I went to the SNCC office at night. Okay, and that started about October 1961. And so Jim right away said, so for several weeks I was typing. That was my job. I was perfectly happy. I would come. I met all these unbelievable field secretaries, Sam Peacock, Willie Peacock, Curtis Hayes, and my job, they would sit next to me and I would type. And they would give me what we later called an affidavit. I don't know where we got this language from. It was not a legal affidavit. And I was a very, very fast typist, self-taught, but I made lots of mistakes. And rather than go through the ordeal of correcting, which in those days, well, I don't want to waste time on that. I made an X where I made the mistake, and I kept going. So even to this day, when I look at some of these documents from 50 years ago, this is now, hello students, 57 years ago, I can tell what I typed because of all the mistakes, so the X's. So, and the field secretaries would, I hope you're explaining to everybody what a field secretary is and all of that.
Why don't you do that very quickly?
Well, SNCC was organized like a wheel, and in the center was the national office, and it went out like this, and everything not in the national office was the field. Where these words came from, as I said, I don't know. And all our resources and everything went to the field. Actually, we got paid more, and because we lived in Atlanta, we had to pay rent. But the conceptual resources and the actual political resources and all the other resources went to the field. And the field was where people were being organized. And it's an interesting model. People still ask me about it today, whether it's a viable model for an organization. So, the field secretary would sit next to me, and he would say, on such and such a date, and I'm typing away, on such and such a date, I took Mrs. Jones and Mrs. Smith and to the courthouse in wherever, Mississippi, because by then we were concentrating in Mississippi, to register to vote, and they waited 8 hours in the broiling sun, and then the sheriff came out, and this one got arrested, and that one got beaten up, and I would be typing. And these things we would send to the federal government. SNCC would. I mean, I just did the typing, and then Jim would send them. And I think we spent easily 2 years sending things to the federal government. This is why none of us are crazy about the Kennedys. And no answer. Even though you students should know that there were laws on the books at the time from 1957 which restricted what these registrars could and could not do. And some of them, there were provisions how they could be disciplined or even arrested if they, didn't act properly when they were registering people to vote. But that law was never invoked. It was never enforced. So that was my job. So then I said to Foreman, I can also write. Okay. Now this is where it's demonstrated that SNCC was not as sexist as the Times were. He immediately said, oh, wonderful. He didn't say, oh, little Jewish girl from New York, who cares, ma? He said, you've got to work with Julian Bond. And on the Student Voice, I said, what is that? And he explained to me that was the monthly newsletter. So I think I must have met Julian around Christmas of 1961, I'm guessing. I don't know exactly. And I don't remember my first vision of him or anything. And he, at the time, I think he was still in school. He might have been still in school.
Right on the edge.
Right on the edge.
Yeah.
And, you know, I can talk about later what my vision of him was, but 2 or 3 months later, I ended up being a roommate with his sister, with Julian Bond. So, let's see, I think it was the spring of '62, Jane and I moved together, naturally on the black side, and I have spent many years explaining to students what this racial, segregation means in terms of housing and how people treat you, and I use the example of how when I first went to Atlanta, I lived on the white side. I lived near Peachtree Avenue. And I remember getting a phone connected, and it was all, oh, this Miss Miller this, and that was my family name, Miss Miller that. And then when I moved with Jane to Telhurst Avenue in the Southwest, the same thing, getting my phone switched, it was hello Dorothy, that the honorific had totally disappeared. And when I talk about segregation, it has been boiled down to Mrs. Park sat down and Dr. King had a dream. I think that's basically what most students are learning, certainly in the grammar school and probably high school. And I try to explain to them how the segregation governed your life from the time you woke up in the morning till the time you went to bed. And my favorite example is Rich's department store, which did not have a dressing room for black women. And it meant, when I first got there, 1962, and this was before, actually, I was there when they did desegregate the facilities at the store. But my most telling example, which I just gave a speech last week, is that a woman could spend $400 on a dress. And there were women, black women in Atlanta at the time, who had $400 to spend on a dress. She couldn't try it on, and she could never return it. So it meant, the subtext of that was, your body will taint this garment. And this is the example, actually, it turns out, that is the most riveting for a lot of people now. Because I think they're sort of used to, oh, well, you sit in the back of the bus and you do this and you do that. You don't realize that every tiny little thing has to do with segregation. And our book, Hands on the Freedom Plow, has some unbelievable examples.
Just show the camera.
Okay. This is Hands on the Freedom Plow. And this book has the most touching example of that. Should I waste time now?
Anything you'd like.
We have a story in the book. This is a book by 52 women, either their own writing or oral history, just a few oral histories, who took her daughter to buy shoes in downtown, some southern city. I don't think it was Atlanta. It was much deeper south than Atlanta. And her daughter, who was the writer of this piece, was 5 years old and had to go to the bathroom. And of course, there were no facilities. So this little girl peed in her pants and was totally humiliated. And she remembered it to this very day. And her mother, for the rest of her life, living with her daughter in the South, took a piece of butcher paper and had her stand on the butcher paper, and she would trace her foot, and she would bring that piece of paper with her to buy shoes rather than bring her own daughter, because she knew if they had to go to the bathroom, that her daughter would be humiliated. So those two examples, somehow that gets through about what this all was like. So Jane, when I lived on the white side, there were black people who worked at Southern Regional Council, and they used to come, but they could only come at night. And this was already 1961, 62. And because if they came at night, well, the chances were less that a neighbor would see that a black person was coming to my apartment. Then, of course, I moved in with Jane, and we were on the black side. Of course, we never had to worry about any of that, because the black people didn't care if I was white, and they were perfectly, accepting. I mean, nobody was jumping up and down, but nobody cared, either. So here I was working with one Bond and living with another Bond. Okay. Now, Julian and I also, by some quirk of fate, were born on the same day. Not the same year, but the same day. We shared birthdays. And I was 2 years older than he, exactly. Okay. So when I met him, this was the winter of 1962, I was 24. So he was 22. So I was coming into work part-time, and so was he, because he had some sort of a job, and I guess it might have been the Atlanta Inquirer. I don't know what his job situation was. And he had at least one child then. And so I imagine our actual contact, was a little bit on the fly. But right away, we worked together really well. I mean, I don't know what he thought of me. I mean, I was, of course, entranced with him, naturally. And the most entrancing thing, everybody says, oh, he was so handsome, blah, blah, blah. The thing that got to my heart was that he was so unremittingly funny. And if you knew him at the height of his wit and his humor, I mean, he was truly a devastatingly funny person. So we working on the student voice, and Foreman seemed to be happy. And then I was fired at the SRC, and because they said my position was being automated out of existence. But the real reason is the FBI had come asking questions about me, and they decided it would be better if I left.
Asking questions about you?
Yeah, about me.
Already?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Made quite an impression.
Well, it's nothing that I did in the South. It was because who I was, and that they must have had a file on me. I've never inquired about my files. I've never gotten my files. Anyway, so at that point, Foreman had been asking me to join the staff. So I said, this is your chance now that I've been fired. Because as I said, it was very cautious. As long as I was working there, and I was still working, and I was volunteering at night. I mean, I think I probably got up in the morning, and I didn't come home until who knows when, 11 or 12. I mean, I just did my job, and I went straight over to SNCC. And of course, I met all the people there. They were getting ready to do, in the winter, in December, I think it was getting ready to do the ride to Albany, Georgia, and I probably met Casey Hayden and Tom Hayden and people like that. In fact, I did meet them at the Southern Regional Council that winter. So Foreman, Emily Crosby now reminds me, must have gotten a grant from the Southern Conference Educational Fund for me. And I had no memory of that. I thought I went straight on staff, but Emily said, no, that's not right. So he must have gotten an initial grant. And so he said, yes, you can come on the staff. Okay. So at that point, I think Julian started working in the office more. And Foreman must have raised money for him. I honestly don't know. And Emily Crosby, when she gets ready with her book, she will know. She will know everything about those early years. So we worked from June through that entire year of '63 and into the summer of '63. So an entire year we were working together in the office. And when Foreman left the city to go traveling to do something, he would have Julian be the person in charge. Now, Julian, for the people who didn't know, first of all, Julian did not like being in charge. And in those days, he did not like being in the center of attention either. If we had lived in a civilized country and he had just been able to do what he liked to do, he would have been a poet, I think. A poet, maybe / professor. But a poet came first, actually. And he was continually being put into positions of authority, which in those years he was not really crazy about. And I remember the winter, must have been the winter of 62, 63, where SNCC had nothing, no money, nothing. And Foreman was traveling, and Julian and I were there in the office with other people, and Julian was in charge, and there was no money to pay for the heating bill, for the gas. And I have this very vivid memory of he and I walking in the neighborhood looking for scraps of wood to burn in the fireplace. We had the fireplace. This was on Raymond Street.
Yeah, I was going to say, are you over on Raymond Street?
On Raymond Street. And we seriously considered burning up some of the furniture. Fortunately, some money came through and we were able to pay the gas bills. So I remember Julian being kind of uneasy those days when he had to be in charge. By then he was 23. And all sorts of things were happening on the field. I mean, you never knew when you were going to get a call that somebody was in the hospital or that somebody was dead. So we sort of lived under that fear all the time. So Jane, of course, is very beautiful. And here is Julian, unbelievably handsome. Both of them really quite witty. I did not hang around the Bond home at all, but I knew all about them. And I knew that Dr. Bond was this legendary intellectual. So the Bonds were not in the commercial middle class, black middle class. They were in the intellectual black middle class. And of course, Dr. Bond was like 3 or 4 on the list of black intellectuals, starting with, W.E.B. Du Bois. But I don't know, I never really got to know him. I got to know Mrs. Bond much more. And Dr. Bond died early on, I think, at least as far as my relationship with Julian. So we were co-workers, and we were friends. And I considered him, he was absolutely egalitarian about the way he viewed people. I don't think he ever thought, in regard to me, this is a white woman. I don't think he even thought of me that way. I mean, he must have, but he didn't. He accepted me the way I was. And the way I was then, I think, was a little difficult because I had come from New York. In New York, you have a meeting at 9 o'clock. You sit down at 9 o'clock, you have a meeting. Here I was in Atlanta. 9 o'clock meant 9 p.m. or 9 a.m. or 3 days later, and I had a lot of serious adjustments to make, and I don't think I was too graceful about it either. So he sometimes defended me. And of course, I would sometimes get a little irked with him because he would say he was coming at 1 o'clock and he would show up at 4 o'clock. But I confided in him. You see, I didn't have too many male friends that I could confide in. We were all the times were so sexist that, it was either you worked with somebody or you had a romance with somebody. There were very few things in between. But for a person who loved gossip the way Julian did, I don't know if you know that.
We do now.
You mean nobody has said this before? He was absolutely, what's the word? If you said to him, this is confidential, he took it to his grave with him. He was absolutely trustworthy in that way. Something that I really appreciated as a young woman. And so I was able to talk to him, to confide in him. The situation was such that Claude Sitton, who was the bureau chief for the New York Times, and it's really important to explain what the bureau chief is because people don't realize, what the print media was like. So he was in charge of the whole South, and he was traveling. He was traveling all over the South. But there were also stringers, and I don't know if people know what stringers are. These are part-time people who will do a story and then they'll get paid for a story. Or if something really is happening and you can't get your regular staff there, then you would call up a stringer and say, can you cover this for us? So Claude Sitton was the reason why we got our first big press, and that was the summer of 1962. And that's when he went to Southwest Georgia, and he was in a church that was surrounded by the sheriff's deputies, and it was a church where voting registration meetings were being held. This was our other great project, was the Southwest Georgia project. And he didn't know if he was going to get out alive, and he was scared to death himself. And fortunately for us, he was there, he was scared, he wrote a story. The story went on the front page. And I think that's what made our reputation, actually. I mean, that's what made us pull away from the pack, was Claude Sitton, this story. So we had a very fond relationship with the press. Now, he knew Claude, I knew Claude, but I didn't know him well. But I knew Fred Powledge quite well, who was the Atlanta Constitution, and Carl Fleming, a little less well than Fred, who was Newsweek magazine. And these were, as a group, very honorable people. And they saw what was going on, and they cared. Okay. On our side, I don't even remember talking about this with Julian, but we must have. We always told him the truth. And this is what I have told young people for the past 50 years. If you work with the press, or you don't say there were 3,700 people when there were 37. You say there were 37 people. Or you say 2 got arrested without saying thousands got arrested. And very quickly they trusted us. So when they called up, and if they, usually they would speak to Julian. He was the communications director. I was his assistant, associate, whatever. We didn't really have titles like that. But normally he would speak to them. But if he wasn't there, I spoke to them. If I said, we got a call that so-and-so was arrested, they would check, but they would be ready to run with the story. This was very unusual, very unusual. And we weren't trying to push anybody. We weren't trying, to promote anybody. We just wanted to tell the story of what was happening. So we had, for that time, that 62 all the way to the summer of 63, a very cordial relationship with the press. And of course, everybody's always critical of the press. I'm critical of them too. But these were good relationships, and they thought very highly of him, very, very highly of him.
So are you talking about the national press, or the New York Times, or larger publications?
Well, Fred was the Atlanta Constitution, the Journal Constitution, so he was local. He was local.
Did you guys have a hard time getting the Constitution to cover the civil rights story?
Well, he was, if I'm not mistaken, he was the Journal, the Atlanta Journal.
The Journal was the evening paper.
Yeah.
The Constitution was the morning paper. That was McGill.
Yeah, Fred Powledge was, it must have been the Journal, whatever was the more liberal, I think.
That would have been the Constitution.
That might have been the Constitution. Yeah. Okay. But anyway, you'd have to, Fred wrote he died recently, several years ago, but he wrote a book, so you can check. and see, you know, which of the newspapers. And then later on, they merged into one.
Yeah.
But this was before before they merged. So I knew him quite well, and he came over and he interviewed Jane and me. He came to our house, and that's what was unusual. Is that we weren't just a news source for them. We were actually human beings. And what they were smart enough to realize was the major story in the domestic story. And their bosses also realized this was the major, well, I don't know if they would have said the major, but a major domestic story. And so it was a little different. It wasn't like scrabbling around so much. After a while, if you got on the phone and you called Fred and said, I got something for you, he called you back, you know. He cared about you.
I want to ask you a couple more questions about your relationship with the Atlanta news media, and I want to bring in the Atlanta Daily World too, because I know there was a lot of tension with the established black press in Atlanta. The Atlanta Daily World, C.A. Scott was not exactly an eager participant. He kind of felt things were moving too fast. He was often critical of Dr. King. The Atlanta Inquirer is set up to kind of be the alternative voice for young black students in Atlanta, and then sort of the younger African American community. Did you have a relationship at all with the Atlanta Daily World? Did you work with them in any way?
No.
Or were you primarily trying to navigate through the Constitution and make this story part of what they would cover?
Well, I know that Julian had close relationships with the Atlanta Inquirer. I actually didn't. I don't remember that we had this sort of bifurcated sense of the local press versus the national press. I think if anything, we tended to concentrate on the national press. And I don't remember, until the summer of '64, I don't remember very many, if any, TV people around. And I don't know whether it's because they themselves had very few people who were traveling on the road. I mean, they were carrying these enormous cameras. I mean, they were hardly mobile. I think the first time I saw a lot of TV people was in the summer of '64 when the three went missing. So I don't know where they were in Atlanta. And I don't remember watching the news in Atlanta either. I have no memory of that. I remember mostly it was concentrating on the national media. At least that's my memory of it. But I know that Julian had a close relationship with the Inquirer. And I really was outside the, internal black politics and internal black community. Well, that's an interesting question. After I went to live with Jane, I was totally in the black community. Later on, a couple of years later, there was much more of a consciousness about organizing, trying to organize in the white community. But in those years, no. I mean, I don't remember anybody even. Initially, I was one of the few white people there. I don't remember Foreman saying to me, you need to attend this meeting. You need to go here. You need to see what the white people are thinking. I don't remember. I mean, my feeling was, I've tried to explain this to young people. When I was out in the white world, that was danger, the dangerous world. When I was in the black world, in the black community, I was safe. So safety equaled black. And I've tried to explain to people who have spent years, hearing, oh, don't go into that neighborhood, it's too dangerous, it's this and that. It was totally reversed for us. Be careful if you go to this XYZ white neighborhood.
Why is that?
Because you would be hurt. You could be arrested. Well, you see, I lived in Atlanta, but I was not in Atlanta. I mean, my mindset wasn't that I'm here, that I care about this. I was living for SNCC. I was living in the black community for SNCC. Had there been a political decision that I, as one of the first, the few white people, and then of course later on there were many more, that we should even sit down and have an organized plan, and that did not happen. So I'm not a person, I just don't know the answer to that. If we were in Atlanta, the worst place that you could be on earth was Mississippi. Okay. Southwest Georgia, which I never went to, was not good, but Mississippi was the ends of the earth. Okay. And as time went on, we had more and more people working in Mississippi. So my function was to tell these national press people what the actual conditions were in the United States of America that most of Americans did not know. And there were some places, as I said, that where our mission was to explain to people, if you were black and you tried to register to vote in the Delta of Mississippi, that was equivalent of me opening this window and jumping out with a parachute from the 15th floor. I mean, you were literally taking your life in your hands. But it was later on that it was in '64, that people tried to organize in the white community. And my ex-husband later on tried again to organize in Mississippi, this time in the late 60s, early 70s. So there were people who cared about that. I actually wasn't one of them. And what Foreman wanted me to do was the press. He also wanted me to do whatever else he wanted me to do. And I was only too happy to do it. And our whole Mississippi chapter was another chapter that is not that relevant to Julian, even though Julian was sort of involved. But Julian did not work out of Mississippi when 1964 happened. By then, he probably had 3 kids, and he wasn't. So, no, I don't know the answers to those questions. I think my only direct experience with fear came before I even got involved in SNCC, when I went to the rabbi in New Orleans and tried to get the rabbi to help the people who were going to organize the first sit-in. And there I saw rank fear, total fear. And I put that down to fear because they were Jewish. And of course, later on I learned that it was fear of being Jewish, but also fear as being a white person to take on some of these other white people. Then many years later, your students should look at an independent film called Jews of the Delta. Now, where you can find this, I don't know. I think I taped it from the television, where you will hear out and out super duper Jewish racists talking about how dare these people come from New York, and things are fine here, and we've always gotten along fine, you know, the fine school of thought. So in my mind, I had crossed over. My racial identification was had changed. So the white people were potentially dangerous, and the black people were potentially friends. I don't know what would have happened if we had had some sort of organized effort. But I was not rooted in Atlanta. I could have been on Mars. Where I was, it was on Raymond Street. That's what I cared about. And I actually thought I was going to be on Raymond Street the rest of my life. I mean, I thought that was going to be my life vocation. And that's one of the things I appreciated about Julian, because Julian had no nationalist feelings at all. I mean, when I look back on it, what on earth made any of these black people, except white people like me? I mean, when we walked out on the street, we white people had the option of being white, of having our privilege. The black people never had that option. It's very hard to work side by side with people doing the same job or similar job when you know half of them outside in the world have privilege and the other half don't. That's why white people were ultimately asked to leave SNCC. This was a contradiction that was never resolved. But Julian, he felt that if you deliberately went on the right side, lowercase r, right side, then that's what counted. And I don't think he thought, oh well, after she works here, she can go to the movies and sit in the orchestra. You know, Jane and I once almost got arrested going to see what's the movie with Lawrence of Arabia. Okay, Lawrence of Arabia was playing, and a bunch of us went to see it. And all we were doing was we wanted to go to see the film. We were not going on a sit-in or a demonstration. And Jane reminds me that we went into a restaurant nearby. She remembers the name of the theater and everything. And we were just killing time until the movie started, and the people panicked. They thought that we were doing a sit-in there. Now, I could have gone to that movie by myself. Nobody would have said, boo. That's what I mean. But they didn't hold it against me. They could have held it against me, but they didn't. Well, I hope everybody realizes that when I talk about myself, or even I talk about Julian and I, what we did it in a context. We were not just doing it as individuals. I mean, these were things that, if anybody, Foreman and Bob Moses were the ones who really articulated the policy. And I consider myself on the food chain, you know, not very high on the food chain. So I think I was quite cynical about the Kennedys. And I knew that all these letters that we were sending off would get no response. And that's what we expected, and that's what we got, was no response. Now, what was going on inside, I don't know. I don't know whether people weren't saying, oh, those pesky people, they have written to us again, and we're just going to ignore that. But they completely ignored us. At least on the record, they ignored us. When the Freedom Rise happened, that was before I got involved in SNCC, and there was some direct contact with John Doerr and other people, and SNCC people seemed to be very fond of John Doerr, by the way, and they felt he was a genuine person. So I think they tried to use that as one of their entrees to the Kennedys. The other entree was the Southern Regional Council, which was more or less considered the goody two-shoes, with the white ladies with the teacups and all of that, but who had money, but they wouldn't get involved. And they were the ones who did not accept Virginia Durr, for example. I don't know if you know who she is. Of course. Yeah. No, Virginia had become too radical for them, or they thought. And they were the ones, the Southern Regional Council wouldn't let Ann Braden even in the door, literally in the door. They were so terrified of her because she was a raving communist, of course. I mean, they literally, while I worked there, she came to visit me, and she could not come in the door. I had to meet her outside. So these people didn't acquit themselves very well, I mean, now when I read all these, if I do read some of these biographies, I'm really disgusted, people promoting themselves about how brave they were, and no. So we didn't expect anything, and we didn't get anything. But the idea was to keep pressing. Now, I would have to say that I grew up in a left family. I was much more left than almost anybody at the time there. And most of the SNCC people, Julian included, were Democrats, small d Democrats. I mean, well, I don't know about Julian and Dr. Bond. I don't know. Most of the SNCC people believed that sooner or later they could kick the door open. Okay, and our job was to give them the nonviolent ammunition to do that. And when we were sending all these press releases around, this was the time when the Kennedys they still had the voice of America, and they were saying overseas, this is the greatest democracy in the world. There's only one little problem here: black people can't vote. So later on, when we got to the summer of '64, that was a different story. That was different. And that effort failed to kick the door open. So,
how about your relationship with the FBI?
well, I had, they had apparently come to SRC. They never came to me directly. But I did have a strange experience with them. And this was probably the summer of '63. No, the spring of '63. And they called me up. I think I wrote about it in the book. They called me up and they said, this guy said, "This is Agent Nicholas." I remember his name. And he said, "Do you know where Dr. King is?" So I said, "No." Now they're calling up this young woman, this young white woman, and they're asking me where Dr. King is. Do you see it? It's in there somewhere.
Yeah.
I mean, so I said, "No, I don't know where he is." So they said, we trailed him to the airport and then we lost him. So I said, "Well, I can't tell you. I can't help you. I don't know where he is." Then I called Julian right away. I remember calling him. I said, "Do you believe this?" So we both howled over this. This was hilarious. I considered them totally ineffective and useless. And then later on, I had another experience with them in Mississippi. Their position was they could do nothing unless a crime was committed right in front of their eyes. That was their stated position. Nowadays, right with the middle of this crisis that we're in about everything, it's like send in the FBI. No, we didn't feel that way. This was part of the apparatus that was oppressing everybody. And everybody knew that the FBI had undercover people who knew about lynchings and never did a thing ahead of time because they wanted to keep their people undercover. Their reputation was very, very, very bad. That either they were useless or stupid or, in fact, collaborators with racists. And they still may be the same, for all I know.
So there was a sense of frustration
yes.
within your office in dealing with the FBI?
Oh, yes. Well, we called them. It was a pro forma thing. You had to call them. So-and-so was arrested. You called the FBI. Just letting you know, so-and-so and so-and-so was arrested. Because we wanted to keep the record. We wanted to make a record. We're making a record to the federal government. Help us. That's what we were saying. Help us. We are legitimate people. We are following the laws of the United States. We are following the Constitution of the United States. This is post-Civil War. Help. And we got nothing, virtually nothing. I think that made people very bitter, as you can imagine. And then when Kennedy died, this incredible, mythology sprang up. How great and how wonderful. Actually, he was very fearful. He had to be dragged kicking and screaming into the civil rights movement. It turned out that Bobby had a lot more integrity than Jack did. Because Bobby was quite vicious and then somehow saw the light later on in his life before he was killed, and it's probably why he was killed. But all of that, did I actually think about that in those days? No. I thought we are supposed to get the apparatus to work on behalf of black people. That's what I thought. And I thought, I am in a black organization. Black people are telling me what to do, and it's fine. It's fine with me. And not only is it fine, I'm lucky to be here. I'm lucky. What do I know how to do? Do I know how to go out in the community and convince Mrs. Smith to go register to vote and lose her job and possibly her life? No, I'm not. I can write and I can type, and I'm lucky that somebody can make use of what I can do. That's the way I thought then, that's the way I think now about my role. That's why I sort of have to laugh at some of this, you know. I mean, I'm a witness to history. People, and I was hit over the head by a cop, and a famous photo was made, you know. Okay, in fact, I was a very hardworking, lower level skilled person. That's what I was. In an organization where some of the leading people didn't have 1/10 of the education that I had, and I looked to them for guidance and leadership. And in an organization where I was one of the older people, let's not forget that. And I remember sitting with Bob Moses in 1962 or 63, and Bob Moses is 2 years older than I am, and we were considered, you know, almost over the hill. So I was 24, he was 26. Foreman was 32, and he was the oldest person in sight, and the oldest person. Well, the student voice was to inform other people in the South about what was going on, and it was to inform this truly immense support network that functioned outside of SNCC. This is having solely to do with Jim Foreman, who was an organizational genius and who set up these Friends of SNCC chapters all over the country. When I think about it, I'm just staggered. And he set up, this method that he set up is now being adopted by everybody. They take it for granted that that's the way you organize. It was very unusual. Here we had SCLC. SCLC did not have support groups in various cities throughout the United States. The NAACP was a membership organization, and they had chapters. And CORE had a couple of projects in the South, and mostly was in the North. So SNCC was really unique in that way. And the method of organizing was totally different from everybody else's. I mean, it was not to promote a great leader like Dr. King. That's the source of the clashes between SNCC and Dr. King. It was to do this day by day, at first inobtrusive, steady organizing, to organize people who would be willing to sacrifice something. So I'll show you the cover. I want to show these students the cover of this book. Yeah. So this is the book that we did with the women. And if you can see, can you see the photo? Can they see the photo?
We just hold it
Can you see?
A little bit higher. Yep, perfect.
Okay.
There you go.
So the photo is important because all of these women are waving a piece of paper that is a pledge that they have a written pledge that they will go to jail at a demonstration, which is one of my favorites because it also shows the enormous amount of women who are participating, which normally don't get too much credit, and that people knew only too well what was going to happen to them, and were all prepared. So
it's a great story behind the photo.
Yes.
We think of like all the iconic photos of that era, and nobody really knows.
Nobody
what
knows
the stories are behind them.
That's right.
And that's
right.
great. Thank you.
So it was used a lot. So this is what we would do. Somebody would say, A church has been burned down. By the way, I'm afraid your thing is going to fall on the floor. A church has been burned down in Southwest Georgia. So Julian would call, or I would call, okay, what happened? And that was our skill, by the way, is finding out what happened. And Julian had worked with the Inquirer, and I had been the editor of my student newspaper. So we knew the rudiments of journalism. We knew who, what, where, when, and why. And that's what we did. And we said, okay, what happened? What time? Who went there? Why did you go there? You know, as opposed to getting a call, oh, this has happened, this is terrible. We actually pinned people down. Well, what has actually happened? And then we wrote it up. And in the summer of '64, when we were in Oxford, which I haven't really talked about much, Julian and I remember very well that we did a workshop because these volunteers, some of them had been asked to be communications people in their own projects in Mississippi. And I remember standing right by the blackboard. Julian and I stood there and we told them, it is your job to keep track of where everybody is, okay? And it's your job, of course, to call if something happens. And it's your job if somebody's missing. That it wasn't just communications to write things, it was to communicate. If somebody was missing, to call the FBI, to call the hospitals, to call the jails, to find people. We had kids there who were, some of them 19 years old. Andy Goodman was 19. And we were very, very, very conscious that they had left their families at home and that we were the ones who were going to have to call their family. And I remember we stood there and we told them, you know, you're in the South now and people don't care about time, but if people go out and they're on a, you know, some errand or something, especially if it's interracial, and if they're supposed to be back at 3 o'clock, I remember saying, if they're supposed to be back at 3 o'clock and it's 10 after 3, start looking. Well, sure enough, the very first day that they went south, this young woman who had been at the workshop, she did what we said, because she was in Meridian, and Mickey and James and Andy did not come back. And she's the one who called the jail, and she got the jailer's wife, who admitted that they had been there. Otherwise, we would never have known where they were. And she said, oh yes, they were arrested, but they've been released. Well, and we knew where to look when people knew where to look. So the communications department was not by any means just writing. It was literally to communicate. The other thing was, I was a recruiter in the Northeast, and most of the people who came south from that area came through the SNCC office there, which I ran.
Recruiter for Freedom Summer?
For Freedom Summer. And in the archives, you can see what we asked. I mean, name and address, and who's your congressperson, your parents' name and address, the newspaper, your local newspaper. Do you know anybody on your newspaper? We were very, very conscious to communicate. This was part of the communications job. Well, the essence of my work was actually quite similar. I mean, I was not expected to go out and do organizing in the field. I was not a field worker. Even when I was in Mississippi, I was not a field worker. For one thing, I personally was useless as a field worker because of the way I spoke. Because I would open my mouth and everybody would know I was not from there. Now, I used to have a much stronger New York accent than I have now, because I lived away from New York for 20 years. But there is a shot there in that film that, can't think of his name, did, about Freedom Summer. Stanley Nelson. There's actually some contemporaneous footage of me interviewing somebody. And I have the heaviest New York accent you can imagine. And I'm saying, you know, something like, do you realize you might be killed? I'm asking some kid. Okay, so in Atlanta, life was a lot easier. It was easier. And what I remember is working on the student voice, doing press releases, getting information from people in the field, and communicating directly with the press. Those are the main things that I remember. And I did other things too. I remember spending at least 2 days at the mimeograph machine doing a petition for somebody who was arrested, who was in Parchment prison. I mean, there were other things, or office things. In Mississippi, it was like we were hunkered down in the bunker. We were in the bunker. I mean, we were in enemy territory. And by this time, I was married. Mickey and James and Andy had died. We all knew they were dead. They weren't found yet. Actually, I didn't know that in the beginning. When they first went missing, I actually thought they were missing. And one of the black guys that I worked with, who I was very fond of, he said to me, "You can't be, they're not missing. They're gone. They're dead." That was a few hours later. He knew, all the black people knew they were gone. They were not missing. So we were in, enemy territory. And I don't remember seldom leaving the office. We were there for 6 weeks. Seldom did I leave the office, except maybe to go to a restaurant in the black community. But there was a white woman who came in, and I have spent all these years being curious about her. And I don't know, but it's too late now, it's too late now. But her actual name was Lady Montgomery, okay? And she was a young white woman who lived on a plantation in next county. And she came several times. Now, whether she was on as a spy for somebody, I never found out. Or whether she was somebody who genuinely wanted to know what this meant. I have never been able to track her down. I'm sure that people actually could. And she might have, I don't know whether she was a spy or who she was. That was very unusual. So that's when Judy and I were shot at. I don't know if she talked to you about that. So that was, another brush with death. And that's when the FBI came, and they were completely useless. I've written about that too. So the difference was that we were communicating in Mississippi not only with the press. We were there if the parents called. We were there to communicate to the lawyers. By then in Mississippi, we had this huge structure of help, auxiliary people. We had doctors there, we had nurses there, we had and lawyers, tons of lawyers. So I remember we were just sort of, helping people sort of travel around where to go and communicate that way. And then we had the Watts line. And of course, everybody knows now about the Watts. Foreman was the one who found there was such a thing as a Watts line. And then it is really staggering how much it costs, because in 1964 dollars, it was very expensive. It was $1,500 a month for the Watts line. And the Watts line allowed you to call anywhere in the United States for as long as you wanted for that flat rate. But you couldn't get incoming calls. So any incoming information had to be in code. And we became quite adept at that. Somebody would, my famous example is, somebody would call and say, this is a person-to-person call. You had to have a person-to-person call. I'm sure some of these students won't even know what this was. And so they'd say, this is a person-to-person call for Dorothy Check. So I would say, oh, she's not here now. So they'd say, when is she coming back? I'd say Thursday. So that meant, where is my check? So we learned how to do some, code. But the Watts line was very, very important. And in Mary King's book, Mary King, that's a very useful book for you to look at about 64, because she took meticulous records. I didn't take meticulous records. And the Watts line was really very important and made all of these calls all over like I told you about this woman in Meridian, and made calls to find people who were missing or who were late. We also had a wonderful 19-year-old boy from Harvard named Peter Orris, and I'm very proud of him because I was the person who interviewed him, and I said, go, go, go. And he set up, all over the state, he set up these two-way radios. So that technically came under the communications. We had to monitor the radios. And we had some hair-raising experiences with people calling in on the CB radio, saying people are following us, and we'd have to keep track of them. So it was like it was in a war zone. That was the difference. In Atlanta, you were, well, at least from just speaking for myself, I was in a halfway civilized place in Atlanta. In Mississippi, definitely. In World War III, I mean, in the war zone. And when I remember the day that we left, we took a bus. No, did we have a car? We didn't have a car. We took a bus to New Orleans, and I remember getting out in the bus station in New Orleans, and I felt like I was in Paris, even though it was segregated there too, but I felt like I was in Paris. So, very hair-raising, very hair-raising. Okay, now back to Julian. Yeah. So, I actually left Atlanta in '63, in the summer of '63, and then I ran the SNCC office in Boston, and my then husband went to Brandeis. And then we went to Mississippi the next year, and then we went back to Brandeis. And when we came back to Atlanta, that was not '65, we were there briefly, and then we went somewhere else. When was Julian's case?
He was elected.
What year was that?
The Supreme Court decides it in 1966.
Right, so he
actually
was
65. He's not seated in January of '66.
Okay.
And that whole process
Okay.
starts.
So we were there. I don't know if we were visiting or whether we were staying there. I think we were living there. And Julian, I remember, was right. He had already been thrown out of the state senate, but he was going to sue. I don't know whether people will be happy about this memory, but this goes to what I said before about Julian's innate self as a person who was contemplative and inward, his natural self. And here he all of a sudden was about to become a national figure, which he didn't know at the time. We didn't know at the time either. We thought it was one of these cases, and and he was so stressed that he had a terrible case of the hives, I remember, and he was beyond stressed because this was not his natural milieu. It really wasn't. And of course he coped with that and it went away. And then I think that is when he started to enjoy being the center of attention. And I think from '68 on, when he was nominated to be vice president, and he had this sort of, he had this mischievous look. Oh, if you knew Julian, you know that look. Mischievous look where he'd tell you, oh, I was so-and-so and I spoke to Whoopi Goldberg. He had this mischievous thing, can you imagine? I know a person like that. Or it was not altogether believing that here he was so famous. And in later years when I'd see him in New York or elsewhere, it was very common. You'd walk anywhere with him and somebody would just come up and, Mr. Bond, I want to shake your hand. He was very grave about that. Thank you very much. Thank you. He grew into that person. When I knew him, he was not that person. He was not that person. And in the back of his mind, I think he kept saying to himself, is this really happening? Which is one of the reasons he thought things were funny. Is this really happening to me? He was a very dear person to me. Okay, I was thinking about that today. First of all, he bridged the black intelligentsia. He was a living bridge between the black intelligentsia and the black community as a whole. Because the intelligentsia, even his father and other people like him, were quite separated from the regular mass of black people. And because of what he chose to do with his life, he bridged that gap. Now, he was not in the field a lot, but he did go into the field. And he talked to regular people in a regular way. And I think there were some black intellectuals who couldn't do that. So in his career, his lifetime career, it turned out that his chairmanship of the NAACP is quite important. I tended to sort of scoff at, well, is this meaningful? But looking back, I think it was meaningful. And when he got the Spingarn Award, he invited me and Judy and other people to come with the family. And that was a really special time. I mean, he invited us because Obama was speaking, but I wanted to see him get the Spingarn, which I had heard about since when I was a child. I mean, I have to say, I was an unusual white person that even had heard of the Spingarn medal. So he grew into this sort of fame, but I think he used it pretty well, and it will turn out that history will say that what he did for the LGBT community, which would have been totally unpredicted in the 60s, will turn out to be one of the most meaningful things that he did. And I don't think he intended it in any way. I mean, it wasn't on his radar. It wasn't on our radar at all. But he was quite brave in his advocacy of that community long before it became popular to do that. And when I went to Washington and I would stay over there, he would be talking about that. That was very meaningful to him. And I'm sure you heard stories about he would be on panels with black ministers and they would be talking about how horrible this was, and he would take them on. He was fearless about that. And what was so amazing about him was that he was so quick. You could say something and just before you knew it came out this incredible statement that was funny, witty, and just on the mark. So I think history will definitely, see him as an important person. But for many things that he did, not just the civil rights movement, but many things. And yes, that's all.
Well, thanks. Floor is yours.
Okay, so this picture was taken by Richard Avedon, and this is a crop version. It actually stretches out to about there. And Richard Avedon came down, I guess it was 1963, and he just fell in love with Julian. I mean, that Julian was personification of this new, young, beautiful, smart, black student community. So he set up this photo. We were standing on the neutral ground in Atlanta, and he had this phalanx of people behind him. So it goes back many people deep. And there's a sign above our heads, and it says Atlanta with an arrow pointing this way. That was the original photo. And this became quite a famous photo. And he just fell madly in love with Julian. So we were all there as, you know, fillers, filled in. But I think also Avedon wanted to get the idea that there were a lot of people in this movement, you know. But it was definitely, see, we would never have taken a picture like that.
Mm-hmm.
But that was Avedon's, you know, you have the beautiful person and then everybody spreads out after that. Now these other photos were taken by Danny
let's talk
Lyon.
about your famous Barefoot photo here. Why don't you tell us about that?
So this is the photo that was taken by Danny Lyon, who is now a very famous photographer.
Yes.
And this was in 1963 in June in Danville, Virginia. And there was a protest there, and I was hit over the head by a cop. And this is form, and unfortunately it's very overexposed, so you can't really see his face well. And he's taking an affidavit. I am giving, quote, an affidavit, meaning a statement, to him, and he's writing down what happened to me. And I'm not posing there, I'm actually holding my head. And I think it might have had lasting effects, because, you know, when you're hit over the head and you see stars, what is happening is that little tiny blood vessels are bursting in your head. And here we had been hosed down by the water hoses, and so I lost my shoes. And everybody says how young I look there. That's a fluke. This is the way I really looked. And this is Danny taking himself, and I'm sitting there, I'm on the phone. You were just saying that, you know, this is so incredible what I'm telling you. And I want you to know that for me, and probably dozens of other people, we were lucky. We were lucky. We just happened to be in the right place at the right time. We weren't so special. We were lucky. I consider it the greatest luck of my life that I ended up down there. Dumb luck, I'd say. So you should factor that in when you think that that people think we're all so heroic. We were lucky.